Hello. Before we begin, a quick note. The Bore You to Sleep podcast relies on you and sponsors, which means you will hear a quick advertisement before the beginning of tonight's episode. While the podcast is free, you are welcome to subscribe for just $2.99 per month, which supports the creation of this podcast and gives you an ad-free listening experience. Simply click the link in the show notes from your podcast app. Rest easy. Hello. Welcome to the Bore You to Sleep podcast. The podcast that will hopefully help you get to sleep. I am going to read an open source book, one that is not particularly interesting, but one that is hopefully boring enough to get you to sleep. Tonight's reading comes from Powers of the President During Crises. This story was published in 1960 and written by J. Malcolm Smithland and Cornelius P. Cotter. I thought it was timely, given what's happening with global politics. My name is Teddy, and I aim to help people everywhere get a good night's rest. Sleep is so important, and my mission is to help you get the rest that you need. The podcast is designed to play in the background while you slowly fall asleep. For those of you who are new to the podcast, it started from my own struggles with sleep. I wanted to create a resource for others facing similar challenges, and I'm so grateful for the amazing community we have built together. This podcast is self-made and self-produced, which is why you'll hear a short ad at the beginning of each episode. These ads, along with the support from subscribers and patrons, enable me to keep delivering this podcast for free to those who need it. Thank you to everyone who shared their words of gratitude with me during the week. Whether through the website or your podcast app, your messages mean the world to me. A special thanks to new subscribers via Spotify for podcasters, and all existing subscribers and Patreon sponsors. My goal is to keep this podcast free and accessible to everyone. If you find the podcast beneficial and would like to support it, there are a few ways you can contribute. Follow the podcast in your app and leave a comment. Of course, you can become a subscriber by clicking in the show notes. It costs $2.99 per month and removes Spotify ads, but importantly, it helps support the episode creation so that others can benefit from it, as well as you. If subscribing is not an option, an easy way is by simply leaving a review and rating in your podcast app. Even one sentence helps out. If you would like to say hello or support the podcast, you're always welcome to visit boreyoutosleep.com. You can always share the podcast with a friend who needs it as another way to support the podcast. In the meantime, lie back, relax, and enjoy the readings. Powers of the President During Crises. J. Malcolm Smith and Cornelius P. Cotter. Forward. The use of emergency power in a democracy raises many questions relative to the constitutional basis for its authorization and the manner of its exercise. If used too little and too late, a democratic state might be destroyed, when the proper use of the emergency power possibly could have saved it. If used arbitrarily and capriciously, its use could degenerate into the worst form of dictatorship. As a boy, I was the chauffeur for a country doctor. One day while driving to see a patient who was gravely ill, the doctor opened his medicine chest and pointed to a glass vial containing morphine. That drug, he said, is the most potent medicine in my chest, but requires great skill in prescribing. Used properly, it relieves pain and suffering. Used improperly, it makes animals of men. Emergency power bears to government the same general relationship of morphine to man. Used properly in a democratic state, it never supplants the Constitution and the statutes, but is restorative in nature. Used improperly, it becomes the very essence of tyranny. By reference to the particular statutes and specific instances, this volume affords a graphic picture of the broad extent to which emergency power has been employed by the United States government in recent years. Many will view this development with alarm, for the many instances of its use make a lengthy list. Military emergency today is but one type of national emergency. Catastrophes and economic emergencies may also require the exercise of this type of power. Indeed, its use in this day and time has been so frequent that the very term emergency is becoming shorn of meaning. In the present volume, the authors describe and comment upon the use of emergency power in the United States since 1933. It is their contention that the use of emergency power was contemplated and provided for in the Constitution. The law also provides restraints upon its use. As Professor McIlwain has concluded, the proper test of constitutionalism is the existence of adequate processes for keeping government responsible. It is comforting to know that these processes exist within our government. The primary requirement of all Americans, then, is to keep government responsible and within these limitations, for only when this is done can emergency power be justified under the law of the land. The always present danger is that emergency power may be used by an officer or an agency of the government in order to have its own way when constitutional or other legal restrictions might irritate or interfere. This danger can be lessened by the selection of good governmental personnel, but removed to a greater degree by the enforcement of these constitutional and statutory limitations, which are made effective at times by resort to judicial review. Readers will be indebted to the authors for the first exhaustive account of the actual use of emergency power by the United States government since 1933. The restraint on the freedom of the individual, the regulation of private enterprise, the control of communications are but some of the topics that receive minute and careful treatment. Some readers will be concerned with the frequency of the resort to emergency power, and will view with uneasiness, as does the writer, the possible curtailment of individual rights. Yet the authors would be the first to agree with the statement that freedom and civil liberties, far from being incompatible with security, are vital to our national strength. Security and rights are here made interdependent. Others will take satisfaction in the flexibility of the United States government that can maintain its democratic character and still have the means of preserving its existence under the tremendous pressure of a world war and periods of economic crises. Irrespective of attitude, the present volume is a telling account of the manner in which the government of the United States has been made adaptable under the Constitution to the problems and exigencies of the modern world. Robert S. Rankin, Washington, D.C. Preface. A preface is a kind of last call to dinner, as it were, in which the authors suggest the purpose of their undertaking, chart the course they have chosen to pursue, and acknowledge the help they have received. This study of the President's use of emergency powers grew out of research and discussions in Washington, D.C., and at Harvard, the University of California, and other institutions. In one sense, it is a sequel to Dr. Cotter's study of emergency powers in Great Britain, prepared under Harvard's Sheldon Traveling Fellowship during the academic year 1951 to 1952. In preparing a political science course at the University of California's Riverside campus, one of the most significant gaps in available sources and treatises about the presidency concerned the vast range of power, generally called emergency powers, available to the chief executive should he choose to follow the prescription used by many predecessors, notably FDR. Both authors have, of course, profited from the monumental work of Professor Edward S. Corwin, whose classic study, The President, Office and Powers, remains the outstanding work in the field. Professor Robert S. Rankin's study, When the Civil Law Fails, contained valuable historical data of particular importance. Both authors have also had the inestimable privilege and opportunity of studying under Professor Charles Fairman, now at Harvard Law School. Professor Fairman's study, The Law of Martial Rule, was very helpful in providing the historical setting for government under military control. The authors were fortunate in having read Professor Fairman's paper delivered at the National War College, A Post-Atomic Situation, wherein it is clearly brought forth that a complete plan and pattern for dealing with a nuclear attack must be worked out that does envisage the restoration of civil government to the nation as quickly as circumstances permit, should the Cold War ever turn into an all-out nuclear holocaust. While the original work on the manuscript was completed before either of the authors came to Washington, both have benefited from the experience of working in the Pentagon, the Commission on Civil Rights, the Republican National Committee, and the U.S. Senate. One is apt to view the executive branch of government from a slightly different perspective, once having been associated with the Hill. And while the Congress may feel powerless to act against a determined chief executive, the power of the purse still provides the most effective of all the checks and balances in our national government, except in time of war. The Fund for the Republic provided the authors with a grant in aid in 1955 to begin work on the book, although the fund had no contact or association with the authors during the preparation of the manuscript. Parts of some chapters have previously appeared as article in the Western Political Quarterly and the Journal of Politics, and the authors wish to acknowledge their appreciation at being able to reproduce all or parts of these articles. Mr. Warren Campbell served as a helpful research assistant while a graduate student at Stanford, and rendered invaluable aid Dr. Norman Small of the American Law Division of the Library of Congress performed an essential editorial task in reading the entire manuscript and suggesting very useful changes. The authors are both grateful to Mrs. Connie Smith, a patient wife, who spent long, dreary hours typing and retyping the manuscript. And last, but by no means least, the authors reserve a special vote of the very deepest appreciation to the Executive Director of Public Affairs Press, Mr. M.B. Schnapper, whose patience, confidence, and continued good humour made publication possible, J. Malcolm Smith and Cornelius P. Cotter, Washington, D.C. Chapter 1. Introduction. The general welfare and military effectiveness of a modern industrial nation depend upon the harmonious interaction of a complex, interdependent network of production and transportation facilities. The interruption of this process at any of a myriad of critical points can disrupt the supply of essential civilian and military materials, possibly undermining the economic health or military security of the nation. The urban concentration of population and the refinement of communication devices and techniques for manipulating public opinion make it increasingly possible to instill in the civilian population a hysteria and terror which could effectively thwart national mobilization. Realization of the magnitude of the problem and a pervasive fear of military assault vitally influence the process of continuous redefinition of the balance between collective authority and individual liberty, which is the essential task of democratic government in war as in peace. Emergency government has become the norm for 20th century constitutional states. An assessment of the adequacy with which democratic government has, in the recurrent economic and military emergencies since 1933, combined mobilization of the power of every individual and of every material resource at its command, toward the objective of national survival and well-being, with the protection of basic individual freedoms and the principle of responsible government, which are the heart of democracy, must in substantial part rest upon an analysis of the contents of the statute books. That is the purpose of this study. Its classification of legislative delegations of emergency powers to the executive since 1933 should provide not only indication of the extent to which coercive powers over persons and property have been granted the executive in the name of emergency, but also a framework for the organization of a series of studies into the use of such powers by the executive branch, and the success of congressional and other efforts to maintain responsible administration in time of emergency. There exists no dearth of recorded efforts to define the ultimate scope of the constitutional emergency power of the American executive. Various justices of the Supreme Court have hypothesized at one end of a continuum inflexible constitutional restraints upon executive response to perceived emergency, and at the other end an emergency power which is either unrestrained or unrestrainable. In this manner the Supreme Court has sought to resolve the conundrum: how can a virtually unlimited emergency power and a systematic body of constitutional limitations upon government action logically exist? How can constitutionalism be aught but an anachronism in the 20th century, unless constitutional governments are equipped with adequate legal authority to carry the body politic through economic and military emergencies of staggering dimensions? The considerable body of scholarly literature in this field is principally devoted to speculation on the breadth of the inherent residual executive, all-war power of the President, and description of occasions on which the nation's chief executives have considered it necessary to exercise a prerogative, power to act according to discretion for the public good, without the prescription of the law and sometimes even against it. But despite such incidents as President Roosevelt's 1942 Labor Day speech, admonishing the Congress that unless it repealed certain provisions of the Emergency Price Control Act by October 1st, he would consider them repealed. Emergency administration is overwhelmingly characterized by joint participation and cooperation of the varying branches of the federal government. American government in time of war does not degenerate to anything resembling dictatorship, and to focus attention upon the exceptions to executive-legislative cooperation in war, administration is to study the pathology of emergency administration. The statute books provide, at any given time, a more accurate indication of the breadth and limits of executive emergency power than do exegesis of the Constitution or histories emphasizing executive action unsupported by Congress. For in theory and in practice, the President will resort to an inherent emergency power only to the extent to which Congress has failed to anticipate and prescribe remedial action for such an emergency. On the assumption that a detailed study of the emergency powers, which have been delegated to the executive by Congress, in the immediate past provides insight into the probable range of such powers, which will be exercised by government in the future. The authors have undertaken to survey and classify such delegations in the period 1933 to 1955. It is believed that the accumulation in selected contexts of the instances of legislative delegation of emergency power will provide striking revelation of the scope and detail of control over individuals and groups which is practiced by constitutional governments in time of emergency. To this we now turn. Chapter 2. The concept of emergency in democratic political thought. When President Eisenhower, on June 16, 1955, suspended the privilege of the writ of habeas corpus and declared a nationwide state of mock martial law in response to a simulated A-bomb and H-bomb attacks, taking a toll of some 14 million civilian casualties, he acted on the premise that the ordinary processes of democratic and constitutional government do not suffice to protect the state in time of emergency, and must surrender to a modified authoritarian regime. This premise is deeply embedded in the teachings of democratic political theory, which, in its traditional and contemporary expression, have counseled the need to abandon the processes of democratic government as the first essential response to emergency conditions. Thus, ironically, the Western democracies which today approach the close of 3 decades of economic and military emergency and turn their faces to additional decades in the shadow land between peace and war, are offered a guiding theory which regards emergency governance as an aberration, supplanting the relationships between the various branches of government and between rulers and ruled, which prevail in normal times. In theory, the struggle to preserve limited and popularly responsible government has already been lost. for this is a luxury we are told we cannot afford. In the United States, we have been especially prone to accept the alleged need for transition from responsible to authoritarian government in time of emergency. For we have on the one hand accepted an interpretation of the Constitution where under the rigid restraints imposed thereby on governmental power are susceptible of contradiction in time of emergency, and on the other hand, we have with considerable complacence assigned to the Supreme Court the function of protecting the essentials of constitutionalism and democracy through periods of emergency. These two attitudes combine to enhance the sense of need and lull the fear of supposedly temporary reversions to authoritarian government, in the belief that it is increasingly essential that emergency action to be sustained by a workable and empirically based theory of democratic emergency governance. The authors have undertaken in the present study to survey the treatment of emergency by democratic political theorists, to review the work of the Supreme Court in assessing the validity of governmental exercises of emergency powers, placing special emphasis upon the implications of the 1952 steel seizure cases, and in conclusion, to submit tentatively an approach to emergency which they consider related to the needs of today and the realities of recent experience. Democratic political theorists traditionally have assumed the need in time of emergency to subvert the governmental processes prescribed for peacetime, and to rely upon a generically different method of government, frequently designated constitutional dictatorship. Many factors contribute to this tendency. First, it must be recognized that a theory of democratic government so comprehensive as to traverse every vicissitude which might confront it cannot reasonably be demanded of political philosophers. Second, a certain amount of inertia is inevitable in any phase of man's endeavors. Thus, it is not surprising that political theorists to date have picked up the traditional interpretation of emergency in terms of the Roman dictatorship, and fitted it into their schemes of constitutional government. It is a safely ambiguous doctrine with the respectability of age. It invests an aspect of the experience of constitutional democracies, about which very little in the way of cumulative knowledge has been attained, with an aura of reassuring and doctrinaire certainty. A third factor influencing the casual reliance of democratic theorists on emergency dictatorship is the tendency to polarize the concept of limited government and the supposed need for unlimited emergency action. This is related to the tendency to exaggerate substantively limited, enumerated powers, and compartmentalized powers as integral elements in the concept of constitutionalism. In posting rigidly circumscribed and divided governmental powers, one posits a need contingent upon emergency to transcend such limitations. The doctrine of constitutional dictatorship fulfills this need. John Locke, describing the architecture of civil government, called upon the English doctrine of prerogative to cope with the problem of emergency. In times of danger to the nation, positive law set down by the legislature might be inadequate or even a fatal obstacle to the promptness of action necessary to avert catastrophe. In these situations, the Crown retained a prerogative, power to act according to discretion for the public good, without the prescription of the law and sometimes even against it. The prerogative can be nothing but the people's permitting their rulers to do several things of their own free choice where the law is silent, and sometimes, too, against the direct letter of the law, for the public good and their acquiescing in it when done so. Properly, the prerogative was exercisable only for the public good, but Locke recognized that this moral restraint might not suffice to avoid abuse of prerogative powers. When one government has utilized prerogative powers for the public good, a successor may retain the habit or resort to such powers, utilizing them for a less worthy purpose. Who shall judge the need for resorting to the prerogative, and how may its abuse be avoided? Here Locke too readily admits defeat, suggesting that the people have no other remedy in this, as in all other cases where they have no judge on earth, but to appeal to heaven. Rousseau also assumed the need for temporary suspension of democratic processes of government in the time of emergency. The inflexibility of the laws which prevents them from adapting themselves to circumstances may in certain cases render them disastrous, and make them bring about at a time of crisis the ruin of the state. It is wrong, therefore, to wish to make political institutions so strong as to render it impossible to suspend their operation. Even Sparta allowed its laws to lapse. If the peril is of such kind that the paraphernalia of the laws are an obstacle to their preservation, the method is to nominate a supreme ruler, who shall silence all the laws and suspend for a moment the sovereign authority. In such a case, there is no doubt about the general will, and it is clear that the people's first intention is that the state shall not perish. Thus the suspension of the legislative authority is in no sense its abolition. The magistrate who silences it cannot make it speak. He dominates it, but cannot represent it. He can do anything except make laws. Rousseau did not fear the abuse of the emergency dictatorship, or supreme magistracy as he termed it. It would be more likely cheapened by indiscreet use. He would rely upon a tenure of office of prescribed duration to avoid perpetuation of the dictatorship. However this important trust must be conferred, it is important that its duration should be fixed at a very brief period, incapable of being ever prolonged. In the crises which led to its adoption, the state is either soon lost or soon saved, and the present need past. The dictatorship becomes either tyrannical or idle. At Rome, where dictators held office for 6 months only, most of them abdicated before their time was up. If their term had been longer, they might well have tried to prolong it still further, as the deceivers did when chosen for a year. The dictator had only time to provide against the need that had caused him to be chosen. He had none to think of further projects. Rousseau was unwilling to rely upon an appeal to heaven. John Stuart Mill concluded his ardent defence of representative government with a shattering side. I am far from condemning, in cases of extreme necessity, the assumption of absolute power in the form of a temporary dictatorship. This is not a loose usage of the term dictatorship, but a forthright support of a grant of absolute power to the dictator. Just as in political theory, the 19th century liberals neglected adequately to provide for the problems which war creates, so also in their economic theory they ignored the dislocations of a war period. In his study of war in the 19th century, Edmund Sylvaner has shown how the liberals' repugnance to the destructiveness of war, their conviction of its immortality and stupidity, coupled with their faith that the economic and cultural bonds which would be created among nations by extensive free trade would prevent future wars, cause them to neglect adequate theoretical treatment of the problem of war in their economic thought. Sylvaner points out, for example, that in his chief work, Elements of Political Economy in 1821, James Mill virtually does not deal at all with war, and Mill's distinguished son is brief on the subject of war. John Stuart Mill, according to Sylvaner's interpretation, seemed to admit that virtually everything that can be said on this theme had already been expressed before him. Thus do democratic political theorists tactically admit the existence of a fatal defect in any system of constitutional democracy. Its processes are inadequate to confront and overcome emergency. And that concludes tonight's readings. I hope you're feeling a little drowsy, and of course if you're not quite tired yet, you're always welcome to listen to another episode of the Boy to Sleep podcast. Until next time, good night.